You were taught that wars end. You were taught that somebody signs a piece of paper, a general takes off his sword, flags lower, bells ring, the soldiers come home, and history turns the page. You were taught a lie, a beautiful, convenient lie, wrapped in a handshake and sold back to you in a textbook. I am Blackwell, and tonight I am going to walk you through 6 wars that technically never ended. 6 conflicts that are still on the books, still running, still waiting. Some of them you know, some of them you forgot, and one of them is so absurd, so impossibly long, so perfectly stupid that when I tell you the number of years it lasted, you will not believe it. You will search it yourself, and then you will come back and you will ask me how this was allowed to happen. Lock your door, turn off your phone. The men who signed these papers are all dead now, but the papers are still alive. The men at Panmunjom don't blink, because the war never ended. I've stood there, July of 2018. A gray, windless morning. The kind of morning where the sky feels low enough to touch with your hand. The concrete slab that divides Korea is 3 inches high. 3 inches. You could step over it without even thinking, and if you did, a soldier would put a bullet into your spine before you finished the motion. I watched a young American private standing at attention across from a North Korean guard who had not moved in 40 minutes. Not a blink, not a breath that I could see. 2 men, both around 20 years old, neither one alive when the war started, both still fighting it. That is Korea in the year 2026. That is what a war that never ended actually looks like. Not fire, not bombs, just 2 boys staring at a 3-inch slab of concrete, carrying the unfinished business of their grandfathers. Let me take you back. June 25th, 1950. 4 o'clock in the morning. 135,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel. They did not announce themselves. They did not ask permission. They came down out of the rain with Soviet T-34 tanks and Soviet artillery, and a man at the top named Kim Il-sung, who had convinced both Stalin and Mao that the South would fall in 3 weeks. For a moment, he was almost right. Seoul fell in 3 days. The South Korean army collapsed like wet cardboard. By August, the remaining defenders were crammed into a tiny perimeter around the port city of Busan, their backs against the sea, waiting to be pushed into it. And then came MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, a man who believed his own legend more than any living human should be allowed to, looked at a map and pointed at a tidal port named Incheon. Everyone told him it was impossible. The tides were wrong. The approach was wrong. The landing was wrong. He did it anyway. On September 15th, 1950, 75,000 men waded ashore behind the North Korean lines, and the war flipped upside down in a single day. By October, American and South Korean forces were driving north toward the Yalu River, toward the Chinese border, toward a country that had warned them not to come. And then the mountains turned white, because the Chinese came. 300,000 of them, in the snow, at night. Without radios, without rifles for half of them, without winter coats, with only whistles and bugles and the will of Mao Zedong pushing them forward. At a frozen reservoir called Chosin, 18,000 American Marines were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures that dropped to 35 degrees below zero. Men's weapons froze, plasma froze, their food froze. They fought their way out through 78 miles of mountain road in 17 days, and when they finally reached the coast, one Marine colonel looked at the ruin of his division and said, "We are not retreating. We are advancing in a different direction." 1,400 Marines were killed. Another 7,000 were wounded, many of them by the cold itself, fingers and toes and ears turning black and snapping off. The Chinese lost tens of thousands. Nobody has a real count. The bodies were left in the ice, and the ice kept them there for decades. And then the war settled into something worse than motion, into stillness. into a line across the middle of the peninsula that neither side could break. 2 more years of grinding, pointless, murderous stalemate. Hill fights with names like Porkchop and Old Baldy and Heartbreak Ridge. 1 million Chinese dead. 36,000 Americans dead. 2.5 million Koreans dead, most of them civilians, most of them buried in unmarked ground that is still unmarked. And then on July 27, 1953, at a tiny village called Panmunjom, 3 men sat down at a table and signed a piece of paper. American General William Harrison signing for the United Nations Command, North Korean General Nam Il signing for the North, and the Chinese signed as well. But look at that list again. Count the signatures. Do you see what's missing? South Korea. The nation whose soil was being divided. The nation whose people had just been bled white. The nation whose capital had changed hands 4 times. The South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, refused to sign. He said signing would make the division permanent. He said he would rather keep fighting. So he didn't sign. And the document is still there, in a glass case in Panmunjom, with 3 signatures on it, not 4. It is not a peace treaty. Let me say that clearly because this is the single most important sentence in this entire chapter. The Korean War does not have a peace treaty. It has an armistice, a ceasefire. A pause button held down by 3 men, one of whose countries wasn't even the one that got divided. 73 years later, nobody has ever pressed play. Nobody has pressed stop either. The war is simply paused. Still paused, as you are watching this. The demilitarized zone is not demilitarized. That is the second lie. It is the most heavily militarized border on planet Earth, 2.5 miles wide, 150 miles long, nearly 2 million soldiers facing each other across it on any given day. On the southern side, 600,000 South Korean troops, 28,000 American soldiers, the forgotten deployment that has been rotating through since 1953. On the northern side, 1.2 million North Korean troops, 70% of the entire DPRK army, permanently stationed within 100 kilometers of that 3-inch slab of concrete. Between them, 1 million landmines. I will repeat that number because it does not feel real when you say it once. 1 million landmines. Some of them 70 years old, most of them forgotten by the maps that were supposed to track them. Animals trigger them. Rainfall shifts the soil and moves them. Farmers on both sides lose limbs to them every single year. There are forests inside the DMZ where no human foot has touched the ground in 7 decades, and they have become, by pure accident, one of the richest wildlife preserves in Asia. Cranes, tigers reportedly seen, bears, a paradise built on top of a minefield. And the incidents never stopped. They never stop. January 21st, 1968. 31 North Korean commandos crossed the DMZ and tried to assassinate the South Korean president in his own house. They got within 1 kilometer of the Blue House before being cut down. 26 South Koreans and 3 Americans were killed stopping them. August 18th, 1976. 2 American officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, went to trim a poplar tree inside the joint security area that was blocking their view. North Korean soldiers attacked them with axes, the axes that were meant for the tree. Boniface and Barrett were killed on camera. The United States responded 3 days later with Operation Paul Bunyan, an 800-man operation with helicopters, B-52 bombers overhead, and a convoy of armed Koreans and Americans who drove to the tree and cut it down while 50 North Korean soldiers watched from 30 meters away and did nothing. March 26, 2010. The South Korean Navy corvette Chonan was sunk by a North Korean torpedo in the Yellow Sea. 46 South Korean sailors drowned. North Korea denied it. The wreckage was razed. The torpedo parts had North Korean serial numbers stamped into the metal. Still denied. November 23rd of the same year, North Korean artillery shelled the South Korean island of Yeonpyeong, killing 4 people, 2 of them civilians. The South returned fire. For about 40 minutes, the Korean War started again. Then it stopped again, paused again. And here is the part that most birthed that the final battle is coming. In 2018, there was a summit in Singapore. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un shook hands and talked about ending it. Nothing was signed. In 2019, in Hanoi, they tried again. Nothing was signed. In 2023, the Biden administration quietly acknowledged in a State Department briefing that almost no American outlet covered that no active negotiations toward a Korean peace treaty exist. The armistice holds the way a dam holds water. Not because the water is gone, because nobody has yet found a reason big enough to open the gates. 73 years, 3 generations of soldiers, born into a war their grandfathers started and their fathers couldn't finish. The young private I watched in 2018 is probably a sergeant now. He is probably still there. Still staring at that 3-inch slab, still fighting the same war. That war has no ending, and anyone who tells you different is selling you a handshake that was never signed. 2 nations signed nothing for 81 years. The Soviet Union and Japan. You would think, after the biggest war in human history, the war that ended in 2 mushroom clouds and a radio broadcast from an emperor who had never before spoken to his people, that everyone involved would have sat down and signed something. You would be wrong. The Second World War officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, when Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the Instrument of Surrender. Dressed in a top hat, leaning on a cane because his leg had been blown off by a grenade in Shanghai years earlier, Shigemitsu wrote his name with a shaking hand. The document he signed was the end of combat. It was not a peace treaty. A general surrender is not the same as a peace treaty. And with most of Japan's wartime enemies, a peace treaty did eventually follow. The United States signed one in 1951 in San Francisco, along with 47 other nations. The United Kingdom signed, France signed, Australia signed, the Philippines signed. Japan had its war with the West formally closed. But one seat at that table was empty. The Soviet Union walked out, refused to sign. And that refusal is still refusing, tonight, in 2026, 81 years later. Why did Stalin walk out? For 4 islands. 4 rocks sticking out of the cold gray sea north of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. A chain called the Kurils. Volcanic, windswept, fog-wrapped, barely 20,000 people living on all of them combined. Japan called them the Northern Territories. The Soviets called them theirs. The dispute traces back to August of 1945, to a clause in the Yalta Agreement between Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. In exchange, the Allies agreed, quietly, that the Soviets would get the Kurils. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Almost exactly 3 months later, on August 9th, the Soviets poured across the border into Manchuria with 1.5 million troops. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. But the Soviet operation didn't stop. Through the last weeks of August and into early September, Soviet forces landed on the Kuril Islands one by one. The last landing, on the southernmost island of Shikotan, was on September 5, 1945. 3 days after the war was technically already over. 20,000 Japanese civilians living on the islands were given a short time to pack and were deported to Hokkaido. They left behind fishing villages, temples, family graves, and in many cases, elderly relatives who could not travel. A few of those elderly Japanese were still living on the islands into the 1950s, finally dying there under Soviet administration, never allowed to go home. The 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty is where it all came apart. The treaty required Japan to renounce any claim to the Kurils. Japan signed. Japan did renounce. But here's the trick. The ugly little legal trick buried inside the paper. The treaty did not specify who the islands were being given to. It said only that Japan was giving up to the Soviet Union, because the Soviets never signed the treaty in the first place. You cannot legally inherit something through a document you refuse to put your name on. So the islands sit in a legal gray zone that has now lasted longer than most countries on Earth have existed. Japan does not recognize Soviet and later Russian sovereignty over them. Russia has occupied them continuously since 1945. And because of those four rocks, those four fog-wrapped volcanic rocks in the cold northern sea, Russia and Japan have never signed a peace treaty. Not in 1956, when they came close, when Khrushchev offered to return 2 of the 4 islands in exchange for a treaty, and the deal collapsed under American pressure. Not in 1973, when Prime Minister Tanaka flew to Moscow to meet Brezhnev and came home with nothing. Not in 1993, after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, when Boris Yeltsin visited Tokyo and signed a declaration saying the islands were a problem that needed solving, without actually solving it. Not in 2018, when Shinzo Abe met Vladimir Putin 27 times over 6 years and made more trips to Russia than any Japanese prime minister in history, and still came home empty-handed. And then came March of 2022. Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Japan joined the Western sanctions, and Moscow announced in a one-sentence statement on March 21st that it was withdrawing from all peace treaty negotiations with Japan, the last bill from the Second World War. Still unpaid, still refused, 81 years later. And nobody alive today will be alive when it is finally settled, if it ever is. A green line drawn with a pencil in 1964. It never washed off. The island of Cyprus, 340 kilometers east of Greece, 100 kilometers south of Turkey. A piece of land the size of Connecticut, where 2 peoples, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, have been locked in a war that technically never ended since British colonial rule collapsed in 1960. The Green Line is exactly what it sounds like. In December of 1963, a British Army officer named Major General Peter Young, trying to stop the intercommunal killings that had broken out in the capital city of Nicosia, took out a green wax pencil and drew a line on a map. Greek Cypriots on one side, Turkish Cypriots on the other. It was meant to be temporary. 63 years later, that line is still there. Widened now into a United Nations buffer zone patrolled by blue helmets. But the line itself is the same line, the same pencil mark, still uncrossed. The violence that had prompted the line was savage. In the Christmas week of 1963, fighting between Greek and Turkish Cypriot neighborhoods in Nicosia killed hundreds. Houses burned. Wells were poisoned with bodies. British troops, the old colonial power, tried to restore order. They could not. The United Nations sent peacekeepers in March of 1964, and those peacekeepers are still on the island today, 62 years later, the longest continuous UN mission in history. The catastrophe came in July of 1974. On the 15th of that month, the Greek military junta in Athens sponsored a coup in Cyprus, attempting to overthrow the Greek Cypriot president, Archbishop Makarios, and merge the island with Greece. 5 days later, on July 20th, Turkey invaded. Operation Attila. Turkish paratroopers descended on the northern coast near the city of Kyrenia. Turkish warships shelled Greek positions. Within 3 days, Turkish forces held a strip of coastline. A ceasefire was declared. On August 14th, it collapsed, and a second Turkish offensive pushed south and east, eventually seizing 37% of the entire island. When the guns stopped, Cyprus was cut in half. 200,000 Greek Cypriots were expelled from the north. 60,000 Turkish Cypriots fled from the south. 5,000 people, on both sides, were dead. Another 1,500 are still listed as missing, their bones being dug up one by one over the decades as forensic teams find mass graves in olive groves and well shafts. In 1983, the Turkish Cypriot leadership declared independence as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Turkey recognized it. Nobody else on Earth did. 43 years later, still nobody else does. The Republic of Cyprus, sitting in the south, is a member of the European Union. The Turkish Republic in the north exists only because Turkey says it exists. And the buffer zone runs down the middle. I've walked it. Nicosia is the last divided capital in Europe, the only one. You can stand in the old city, in front of a crumbling Venetian building in the buffer zone, and see barbed wire, sandbags stacked in 1974 that have never been moved, and a Turkish watchtower 100 meters away with a soldier looking down at you through binoculars. Tourists drink cocktails at a cafe 50 meters from a loaded machine gun position. Nobody talks about it. The talks have failed. 1984 failed. 1992 failed. The Annan Plan of 2004, put to a referendum, rejected by the Greek Cypriot side. The 2017 Crans-Montana summit in Switzerland, Antonio Guterres personally chaired it, collapsed in a single night. The last serious negotiations were in 2021 in Geneva. They ended without even a joint statement, and there it sits. A member of the European Union, cut in half by the army of a country that wants to join the European Union. A green line drawn with a pencil 63 years ago, still uncrossed. An island with two armies, two currencies, two languages of government, two flags, and not one single peace treaty. Tourists sunbathe 400 meters from loaded guns, and every summer they do it again. Two nuclear powers, one valley. 78 years of bleeding, India and Pakistan. The partition of British India in August of 1947 was the largest single migration of human beings in recorded history. 14 to 18 million people moved in a matter of weeks. Hindus and Sikhs fleeing the new nation of Pakistan heading east into India. Muslims fleeing the new nation of India heading west into Pakistan. On trains, on bullock carts, on foot. Old women carrying grandchildren. Families pushing wheelbarrows full of everything they still owned. And the violence that followed was beyond any ability to describe. At least 1 million people died. Some estimates go as high as 2 million. Entire trainloads of refugees arrived at stations with nobody alive inside. The cars painted red with blood on the outside, the seats full of corpses. Women were abducted by the tens of thousands. Villages were emptied and burned in a single afternoon. Neighbors who had lived together for centuries murdered each other in driveways. The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir sat at the heart of the catastrophe. Kashmir was majority Muslim but ruled by a Hindu Maharaja named Hari Singh, who could not decide in the summer of 1947 whether to accede to India or Pakistan or try to remain independent. While he hesitated, Pashtun tribal fighters from Pakistan crossed into Kashmir in October 1947, looting and massacring as they moved toward the capital, Srinagar. In a panic, Hari Singh signed the Instrument of Accession to India on October 26, 1947. Indian troops were flown in the next day. Pakistan responded. The First Indo-Pakistani War had begun. It lasted until January of 1949 and ended with a UN-brokered ceasefire that split Kashmir roughly in half along what is still called the Line of Control. That line has never been turned into a recognized border. Because neither side recognizes the other side's half. 1965, Second Indo-Pakistani War, again over Kashmir. Several thousand dead on both sides, a tank battle at Asal Uttar that was the largest since the Second World War, a Soviet-brokered ceasefire. No peace. 1971, the Third War, this time over the secession of what had been East Pakistan. Indian forces intervened on the side of Bengali independence. In 13 days, the Pakistani army in the east surrendered. 93,000 Pakistani soldiers became prisoners of war, the largest surrender since the Second World War. The nation of Bangladesh was born. But the Kashmir question remained open. 1999, the Kargil War. Pakistani soldiers and militants seized high-altitude positions in Indian-administered Kashmir during the winter, and when the snow cleared, Indian troops discovered them at elevations above 15,000 feet. The fighting that followed took place on ridgelines where men could not breathe without oxygen, where a bullet fired uphill had to be aimed almost at the stars to hit anything. 500 Indian soldiers dead, some 4,000 Pakistani dead, though Pakistan has never officially admitted its soldiers were there. Both nations had tested nuclear weapons the previous year. For a few days in the summer of 1999, the world held its breath. And then, above all of it, sits Siachen, the Siachen Glacier, the highest battlefield on Earth. Indian and Pakistani forces have faced each other there since April of 1984, when India launched Operation Meghdoot and seized the glacier before Pakistan could. The glacier sits at elevations between 18,000 and 22,000 feet. Temperatures drop to 60 below 0 Celsius in winter. More soldiers have died from the cold, from avalanches, from altitude sickness, from crevasses than from enemy fire. Estimates say 3,000 dead on both sides combined. From the weather. The soldiers rotate through in short tours because staying too long destroys the body. Lungs bleed, fingers blacken, men go snowblind, and they sit up there at 22,000 feet and they watch each other across a glacier that nobody can even pronounce for a war that nobody can remember starting. In February of 2019, after a suicide bombing killed 40 Indian paramilitary soldiers in Kashmir, India launched airstrikes against what it said was a militant training camp inside Pakistan. Pakistan shot down an Indian fighter jet. The pilot, Wing Commander Abhinandan Varthaman, ejected, was captured, and was returned 2 days later after a brief international panic about the possibility of nuclear escalation. In August of that same year, India revoked the special constitutional status of Kashmir under Article 370. The region was placed under direct federal rule. Communications were shut down for months. Indian troops poured in. Pakistan protested, recalled its ambassador, cut trade ties. Nothing was resolved. In May of 2025, after another terrorist attack in Kashmir killed 26 tourists, India and Pakistan exchanged airstrikes and artillery fire across the line of control for 4 days. A US-brokered ceasefire stopped it. No peace. There has never been a peace treaty between India and Pakistan. Not one. 78 years, 4 wars, countless smaller clashes, 2 arsenals of nuclear weapons pointed at each other across a line drawn in the mountains, and men freezing to death at 22,000 feet over a glacier whose name their grandfathers could not pronounce. The highest battlefield on Earth. Nobody remembers what they are fighting for. Same war, different phase. Kim changed the rules in 2024. I know. I already told you about the Korean War, but I have to come back to it, because in December of 2023, something happened that most of the world did not notice and almost nobody understood the weight of. Kim Jong-un stood before the plenary session of the Workers' Party in Pyongyang, and he announced that North Korea would abandon the goal of reunification with the South. Reunification, the single arch of reunification on the highway south of the capital, the one you see in every documentary about North Korea, was torn down with bulldozers in the first week of January 2024. Kim declared in his speech that South Korea was no longer the same nation, no longer a brother people temporarily divided. South Korea was now, in his own words, the principal enemy state, a foreign country, a target. Let me explain why this matters. For 71 years, the fiction of the Korean War had been held together by a single idea, that it was a civil war. That both Koreas, despite their armistice and their hostility, were still ultimately one people who would one day come back together. Every round of talks, every summit, every humanitarian exchange, every family reunion, every Olympic opening ceremony where they marched under a unification flag, all of it rested on that fiction. Kim Jong-un, in a single speech, ended it. He said the quiet part out loud. There is no reunification. There are two countries, and one of them is my enemy. And if you are wondering what practical consequences flow from this, the answer came fast. North Korea blew up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office that had been built at Kaesong in 2018 as a symbol of engagement. They had already blown it up in 2020, but in early 2024, they demolished what was left of the building. Roads connecting north and south, the ones built in hope during the Sunshine Policy years, were torn up with explosives. Bridges were mined, rail lines severed. The border wall along the DMZ was reinforced. And then, in May of 2024, came the balloon war. North Korea began sending hundreds of balloons south, carrying garbage, manure, parasites, and cigarette butts. South Korea responded by resuming loudspeaker broadcasts at the border for the first time in 6 years. K-pop music and news about the outside world blasting across the DMZ at volumes loud enough to be heard several kilometers into the north. Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, personally warned that the broadcasts would be considered an act of war. The broadcasts continued. South Korean farmers in the border counties reported that the balloons were landing in their rice fields, dropping packages of human excrement on their crops. And then, in October of 2024, North Korean troops appeared in a place no one expected to see them: Ukraine. Or rather, Russia. Kim had signed a mutual defense treaty with Vladimir Putin in June of 2024, and by autumn, North Korean soldiers were arriving in Russia for deployment against Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. South Korean intelligence estimated that by late 2024, between 10 and 12,000 North Korean troops were fighting inside Russian territory. The casualties were enormous. By the summer of 2025, more than 2,000 North Korean soldiers had been killed in Ukraine-related operations. According to South Korean military assessments, Pyongyang did not acknowledge the deaths. Families at home were told their sons were on training missions. And here is the final, terrible piece of it. The Korean War Armistice of 1953 was signed by the North Korean People's Army, by the Chinese People's Volunteers, and by the United Nations Command. It was not signed by the Republic of Korea. For 70 years, nobody cared about that technical detail because nobody was actively trying to reopen the question. But in 2024, Pyongyang began quietly arguing in its own state media that the armistice was a dead letter, that the counterparties no longer existed in their original form, that the agreement was effectively void. If they ever formally renounce it, and they have not yet, the Korean War is no longer paused. It is restarted. Two nations that spent 70 years pretending to want peace, one of them finally said the truth. And the truth is that the war is not over. It never was. And it is closer now, in the year 2026, to becoming hot again than at any moment since 1953. You are watching the longest-running war in the world reload its chamber, in real time. A war nobody fought, that lasted 101 years. This last one, I promised you at the beginning, is the most absurd story in this entire video. I promised you that when you heard the number of years, you would not believe it. So here it is. In 1904, the tiny Balkan kingdom of Montenegro declared war on Japan. Montenegro, a country with a population of about 250,000 people, an army of roughly 12,000 men, a coastline on the Adriatic Sea, 6,000 miles away from Japan. Why did they do it? Because Russia did it first. In February of 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War began. Russia and Montenegro had close ties. Montenegro had been Russia's oldest ally in the Balkans for 100 years. Russian Grand Dukes had married Montenegrin princesses. The Montenegrin ruler, Prince Nicholas I, had attended Russian military academies in his youth. When the news of the Japanese attack reached his court in the old royal capital of Cetinje, Nicholas declared war on Japan in solidarity with St. Petersburg. It was a gesture, nothing more. Montenegro had no navy capable of sailing to Asia, no army that could be deployed at that distance. What they sent, according to the few records that survive, was a handful of volunteers, perhaps a few dozen men, who traveled to Russia and fought as part of Russian units on the Manchurian front. One name is preserved in the records, a Montenegrin officer named Alexander Savo Lekic. He fought at the Battle of Mukden in February of 1905 on the Russian side. Some historians believe he was the only Montenegrin soldier who actually saw combat against Japanese forces. When the Russo-Japanese War ended in September of 1905 with the Treaty of Portsmouth, Montenegro was not invited to the negotiating table. Russia signed. Japan signed. Nobody mentioned Montenegro. Nobody asked whether Montenegro wanted to end its war. Nobody remembered that Montenegro had even declared war. And then things got worse. In 1918, at the end of the First World War, Montenegro was absorbed into the newly created kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which later became Yugoslavia. Montenegro, as an independent country, ceased to exist. Its king, Nicholas I, died in exile in France in 1921. The Montenegrin royal house was dispossessed. The court archives were scattered, and somewhere in that transition, a piece of paper, a declaration of war against Japan from 1904, was simply lost. Nobody thought about it. Nobody repealed it. Nobody brought it up at any of the peace conferences that redrew the map of Europe after the First World War or the Second. Yugoslavia did not inherit the declaration because Yugoslavia took the position that the old Montenegrin state had been legally absorbed and its independent foreign policies extinguished. But Japan, for its part, never received any document revoking the declaration either, so the war, on paper, remained in force. I want you to feel the weight of this. A war declared in 1904, forgotten by 1905. The country that declared it ceased to exist in 1918. The second nation it had fought, the Russian Empire, ceased to exist in 1917. The king who signed the declaration was dead by 1921. And yet, because nobody ever signed a peace treaty, because nobody ever explicitly canceled the original paper, the state of war continued, decade after decade, through the First World War, through the Spanish flu, through the Second World War, through Hiroshima, through the Korean War, through Vietnam, through the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, through the wars of the Yugoslav succession, through September 11th, a state of war between a country that did not exist and a country that had forgotten. Finally, in May of 2006, Montenegro held an independence referendum and voted, by a narrow margin, to separate from Serbia and reconstitute itself as an independent country for the first time since 1918. And in the scramble to establish its foreign relations with every nation on earth as the newly reborn Republic of Montenegro, some diplomat in the foreign ministry in Podgorica, going through old imperial archives, noticed something extraordinary. A piece of paper, a declaration of war against Japan, dated 1904, still unrevoked. In June of 2006, the government of Montenegro and the government of Japan exchanged quiet diplomatic notes. The declaration was officially rescinded. A peace of sorts was announced. 101 years, 10 months, and a handful of days after it had begun. The longest war in modern history. 0 bullets fired on Montenegrin soil. 0 Japanese casualties inflicted by Montenegrin forces. 0 invasions. 0 battles. 0 hatred. 101 years of pure bureaucratic absurdity. 2 governments, generations of them on both sides, never bothering to close a file. Because nobody remembered the file existed. They told you wars end. They don't. They wait. They sit in archives. They sit in armistices that nobody converts into treaties. They sit on glaciers at 22,000 feet, in buffer zones patrolled by aging blue helmets, in 4 fog-wrapped islands nobody can sail to, in a green pencil line that has not washed off in 63 years, in a constitution that erased the word reunification, and in a piece of paper from 1904 that outlived every single person who ever knew it existed. The history you were sold ended neatly. The history that actually happened is still happening, tonight, as you watch this. The armistice at Panmunjom is still paused. The Kurils are still occupied. Nicosia is still split. Kashmir is still bleeding. Pyongyang has already reloaded. And somewhere, in the archives of some other government, right now, there is probably another piece of paper, another declaration, another war nobody remembers, waiting for someone, a century from now, to find it. I am Blackwell. The documents are still alive. Close your door, turn off your light, and never trust a handshake you did not see signed.